Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this, we think the seventh of the webinars that Taumata Arowai, the Water Services Authority, is presenting on the Wastewater Environment Performance Standards. My name's Tim Cadogan. I'm the Local Government Engagement Specialist here, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'll introduce our presenters, Sarah McFall and Michael Petherick, who you will hear from later. And it's gratifying to see that we have, at this stage, 85 people who have registered to join this webinar. So thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime or delaying your lunchtime to be with us today. And I'll start us off with karakia. Whakataka te hau ke te uru, whakataka te hau ke te tonga, kia makinakina ki uta, kia matatara ki tai. E he aki ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he ho, ti hei Māori ora. So to get us underway, just to explain some housekeeping or how we'd like to run things, we'll have this broken up into two parts. There's 4 different standards that are promulgated to be coming in. 2 of them are about discharges to land and wastewater, and we've found in the previous webinars that that's where the majority of our questions lie. So as the webinar progresses, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and we will stop after those discharge to land and discharge to water components to answer the questions. Now, if your questions relate to stuff that is not relevant to the 2 portions I've just mentioned, then obviously we will come to them in the course of the rest of the webinar. But also, if something comes to mind after we've had that break to talk about the questions on the 2 discharge components that relate to those 2 discharge components, you can put them in afterwards and we'll come to them as well. So the other thing that would be really helpful for us is if you are putting your question into Q&A, if you could possibly just put your title and where you're from. It just helps us not have to go back and research who everyone is when we've got at the moment 50 odd people on the I was going to say the show. That will do. So with no further ado, because I'm starting to stumble over my words, I'll pass over to Sarah McFall, who will take us through.
Thanks, Tim. Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for being with us today. The plan, as Tim was saying, was that we'll make sure there's plenty of time for questions and discussion. I'm just going to give a little bit of a context about the development of the draft wastewater standards and kind of how we've got to where we are at the moment. And then I'm going to hand over to Michael Petherick, who will talk about the standards themselves. So I guess the first thing to say is that developing New Zealand's first national wastewater standards is a real priority for this government and responds to an issue that you will all be very familiar with, which is that we are facing a real challenge with our ageing infrastructure, with the cost of consenting and the time it takes to get consents in place. Some of our infrastructure is very elderly, and so we feel that this is a really good time to be talking to the sector about putting in place these standards. If we go to the first slide. So our goal in developing the draft standards is to balance 3 things. The first of those is about improving public health and environmental outcomes, obviously really critically important. We're balancing that against the need for the standards to be affordable. So we're looking really carefully at the cost effectiveness and efficiency. And you may have seen in some of the material we've published that we've done some case studies where we've tried to look at what some of those cost efficiencies might be. We'd be really interested in any specific examples anyone on the call has. And we're going to continue to do more work on that as we go through the next few weeks. And obviously the other thing is really important is that we are, to the extent we can, managing community aspirations. And if we think about improving the management of overflows, that will be really important to communities who want to be able to, swim at their local beaches. So those are the 3 things that we're trying to calibrate as best we can with the draft standards. Really interested in whether people think we've got that right or where we might need to make adjustments. If we go to the next slide. This will be very familiar to most people, but we've done a lot of work looking at consents around the country. We're aware of around 60% of consents that will be coming up for renewal in the next 10 years. And we know that there are a number of consents, a number of wastewater treatment plants that are operating on expired consents, over 20% of them. On average for 5 years, but in one case, there's a plant has been operating on an expired consent for over 20 years. So we feel it's really important to do this work now, get ahead of the bow wave of consents that are coming up for renewal. And that's why we've been working flat out to get out to consult on these now. So this slide, I won't dwell on too much, but it's something we'd like to hear more about. We are trying really hard to hit a sweet spot where we are balancing improving treatment quality and setting limits that will improve environmental outcomes, as well as being affordable. And so that is trying to strike that balance, as it says there. We're hoping we've done that, but that's what we're hoping the consultation will flush out. No pun intended. So just a few things about the legislation we're working within and legislation that's before Parliament at the moment. So we already have the ability to set wastewater standards, and they can be for a number of different things. We are prioritising the four we're going to talk about today, as we think they're the most sort of common. But in addition to those, we could also set standards for air emissions and for trade waste, and that's something we might do down the track. Another important thing to note is that the standards will only apply to public wastewater networks, and that includes those networks on Crown land, so for instance, corrections or the Defence Force, but it doesn't apply to septic tanks or to any wastewater facilities on private land. The standards won't be retroactive. They will only apply as consents come up for renewal. So this will be something that they'll be coming into effect over the next few years and dealing with that bow wave of consents coming up for renewal. One of the things that's really important to us and something we're working through really carefully, and Michael and John will talk about this a bit later on, is that we have very specific treaty settlement obligations, particularly in the Waikato-Waipa catchment as well as the Whanganui catchment. And we have also got other treaty obligations, and we are trying to engage with as many iwi Māori as we possibly can to look at what we need to do there. And we have done a series of case studies that we'll talk about later to better understand the views of mana whenua. And finally, as many of you will know, there is a bill going through select committee process at the moment, and that makes some pretty important changes to the setting of wastewater standards. I'll just mention the two most important. The first is that the standards will not be minimum standards. They will be what are being referred to as single standards, and what is meant by that is that they are the standard, and resource consents cannot set limits that are higher or lower than the standards that will be put in place. That is something I think will be a matter of quite a lot of discussion, and so we're really happy to talk about that later. The other important difference is that Cabinet will be setting these standards. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the timeframes and what will be happening, but we will be taking all of the feedback from this consultation and from all of the engagement we are doing and providing advice to ministers who will make the final decisions. I won't dwell on this very much, but this just shows you a picture of the different sort of regulators in this space. So we are not the main regulators, environmental regulators for wastewater. That remains the regional councils. Our role is a standard setting role or an oversight. And so we, for instance, do public reports on the environmental performance of networks. And then the economic regulator, the Commerce Commission, is coming online later this year, and they will be doing information disclosure, and you might have seen they're consulting on their proposals for what that might look like in terms of being another regulator in the sector. So how did we get here? It's taken us a lot of work, and we've worked with a lot of people to come up with the draft standards. We started with some technical reports that we commissioned, and we looked at international best practice as well as what's happening in New Zealand. Wastewater standards are really common overseas, so we've looked at what's been done over there. And we also set up a technical review group, which we were very lucky to have some incredibly engaged people helping us. And that included people from territorial authorities, regional councils, our board, our Māori advisory group, and some really, really excellent industry experts. And that group had spent about 3 months working with us and provided incredible input, and we're very grateful for their time. We've also engaged very broadly, talked to our ministers, obviously. We've received extra technical advice. And as I mentioned before, we've done case studies. And so we've brought all of that together into the drafts that we've shared. And I think we have something really robust and credible to engage the sector with. And we are now currently in an 8-week consultation process, which kicked off last week. In addition to seeking formal submissions, we're doing as much engagement as we can. We're really open to having meetings with groups if that would be useful. And we'll continue to receive technical input as we need, so that as we finalise the proposals to take back to ministers. I am going to hand over to Michael now, who's actually going to get into the detail of what's in the standards, and then we'll do some Q&A. So thanks. Over to you, Michael.
Kia ora koutou, Michael Pethricks. I'm the project lead for the Wastewater Standards Work Programme. So what you can see here are the 4 areas that standards will cover. And you kind of need to think of these standards as being pretty much like a national environmental standard that is made under the Resource Management Act. That's the scope of the standards. That's the breadth of what they could cover, and their reach and integration into the resource management system. So those first 2, discharges to water and discharges to land, they're really focused on the plant infrastructure. So those are the main areas that you would expect to see consents being issued for treatment plants for their discharge either to water or to land. Beneficial reuse of biosolids. So that particular standard is based on some long-standing guidelines promulgated by Water New Zealand, 2002, 2003. Those guidelines were always intended to be a national environmental standard, but the Ministry of the Environment didn't get them over the line. They've been in guidelines ever since, so we are well overdue. They've been reviewed a couple of times, comprehensively once last year, and we're overdue for a standard in that area. And then finally, there is a proposed standard for overflows and bypasses to bring some consistency around planning and consenting for overflows and bypasses, and a risk management framework. So the first standard, and this is the one that most people think of when they are thinking of environmental performance standards for wastewater. So the discharge to water standard, what the standard proposes is that we categorise water bodies. So there are 7 categories of water bodies, and they essentially vary based on sensitivity of the water body. So we go from open ocean, a big moving saline environment with a lot of assimilative capacity. Then we go through to near coastal environments. Then you have freshwater environments that decrease in dilution. You have estuaries, which are sensitive environments with a lot of people in them. And then finally you have lakes, highly sensitive environments, freshwater environments. So we're proposing categories for those freshwater environments. And then there are treatment requirements for key contaminants. And so basically what the standard proposes is that you identify the discharge environments for your wastewater treatment plant, and then your treatment requirements are set. Now, as Dr. before said, so the treatment requirements are based at a level that is intended to protect the health of communities, protects the environmental outcomes. They are based on an understanding of what's in consents at the moment. They are based on an understanding of what our freshwater quality is like at the moment, but also set at a level that is affordable for communities, because there is no point in proposing a set of standards that the communities can't afford and achieve. So monitoring and reporting requirements. This is quite a big area across all the standards. So nationally consistent monitoring and reporting requirements around the discharge standards, and also really clear compliance requirements. So it's really clear to a territorial authority and the regional council when a consent limit is breached, what you have to do as part of your monitoring, and the reporting requirements. That's a big change from the current system, where basically there are as many monitoring and reporting requirements as there are consents, and probably more. There is a huge range in monitoring and reporting requirements, and it holds back understanding of environmental performance. It holds back transparency to our communities. It holds back territorial authorities as they operate those plants. We are proposing a specific standard for small wastewater treatment plants. That's plants that are serving populations of 1,000 or less. Speak a bit more about that as we get to it, but there are half of the plants in the country are serving populations of 1,000 or less. They are by and large oxidation ponds. They run passively. They often don't have power on site, and they operate quite differently to the plants serving our big towns and cities. They usually also have a low environmental impact, particularly in relation to nutrient discharge, when compared with the diffuse sources from places like farms elsewhere in the catchment. So we'll go through the detail of what's proposed in that standard, and we're seeking feedback on what it's going to look like. So where the government's proposing that where a new consent is issued under the standards regime, you would receive a 35-year consent for that standard. Again, that's a really big change to the current system, where 10 to 15-year consents are common. Also, those really short-term bridging consents where you just can't achieve an upgrade. So what the government wants to achieve here is essentially allowing councils both to have the certainty around their consenting, and so they can plan and then fund long-lived infrastructure. Finally, exceptions are proposed where standards wouldn't apply. So a couple of examples of exceptions are pristine water bodies that are in a really high quality, or situations where the discharge goes to a water body and it's a very low dilution environment, so the discharge is regularly overwhelming that water body. Where there's an exception, the standard itself wouldn't apply, and you would go through the normal consenting process. The exceptions are intended to be exceptions. If you think of your bell curve, we're talking about the little bits either ends. So pristine water bodies make up about 6% of all of our water bodies, and most plants are not discharging to them anyway. So we're really talking about exceptional situations. Low dilution water bodies, at the moment there are about 30 plants discharging to low dilution water bodies. They are historic, often historic infrastructure decisions where a drainage ditch or a tributary is being used basically as a pipe. And so the standards wouldn't apply in that situation, and the council would be able to make a decision, build a pipe, get it out of that low dilution water body, move it to a water body that has a higher assimilative capacity, and have the standards regime applying. So this pictogram has won a lot of fans, mostly inside of the Water Services Authority, because it makes it very easy for us to explain what we're up to. So this is the treatment wheel. So you can see marked 1 to 7, the different receiving environments. So open ocean, inshore coastal, high dilution freshwater, medium dilution freshwater, low dilution freshwater. Then we have our estuaries and lakes. And as you go around the treatment wheel, the treatment requirements generally increase. as you go around. And of course, the cost of treatment also increases. Next slide, thanks. So this slide here is the one that engineers like those who are on the call, environmental scientists and also plant operators, understand really well and makes them sit up in their chairs. So if we look down the left-hand side, we can see the different contaminants that are proposed as to be have limits as part of the standard. So we have BOD, total suspended solids, total nitrogen, total phosphorus. There is a separate standard for ammonia because it's toxic to plants and aquatic animals. And then we have a standard either for E. coli or enterococci, depending on whether you are discharging to freshwater or the ocean, so a pathogen standard. We have the measurement approach that's taken for each of those. So an annual median is proposed for those contaminants where you would expect there to be some variation over the course of a year. So you need to meet an annual median, and that is to enable the plant operator to vary the plant operation based on things like seasonality, based on other factors that are going on inside the plant or out there in the environment. For ammonia, E. coli, enterococci, the proposal is an annual 90th percentile, so a much stricter approach because breaching those requirements has quite significant impacts for public health or environmental outcomes. Along the top, you can see we have on the left-hand side, we have grouped the freshwater environments from lakes, rivers, high, medium and low sensitivity, and then we've got estuaries, low energy coastal and open ocean environments. You'll see with the open ocean, there are a few areas where treatment is not required, and that is based on our understanding both of the assimilative capacity of the ocean and what you would expect to see in modern consents based on modern plant operation. Next slide, thanks. So as Dr. Fall said, regional councils can't require higher or lower levels of treatment in a consent. So the standards would have direct effect. They would go directly into a consent, and so set standardized monitoring and reporting. They only cover the most common contaminants, so heavy metals, for example. Looking across all of the consents in the country, there are only 7 plants with consents that have limits for heavy metals. Many have monitoring requirements, but there are only 7 that have limits. 6 of those are large treatment plants serving large towns and cities. They discharge to the open ocean and they have a high trade waste component. So that's 6 out of 320 odd, right? So the proposal is that limits for heavy metals, if required, which is the significant exception, would continue just to be set through the consenting process. We're also proposing some comprehensive guidance to be developed to support implementation, so it's really clear what receiving environment you're falling into, how the standards are intended to apply. Also going to be working with the sector on the sampling rates, the monitoring and reporting. So just to dwell on the slide just for a second, because this is a territorial authority audience, so the intention here really is to provide, the government's intention is to provide a whole lot of certainty for you as part of the planning and funding of your treatment plants. So you would know really early in the piece when you are talking to your community about your plant exactly what the treatment requirements are, and that will both enable you to have better conversations with your communities and plan and fund with a whole lot more certainty. In the conversations that we've had with councils to date, and so we're still pretty early in the engagement process, but people are already talking about, well, if I know that plant, which is discharging to an estuary, if I know that the treatment requirements are set for discharge to open ocean, we should move the pipe out there and that would significantly decrease the operating cost of that plant and also remove it from a sensitive environment. So really encouraging to hear those conversations going on. Other conversations that we've heard are things like, oh, well, we have 3 or 4 plants, 3 of them are discharging to fresh water, 1 is discharging to open ocean. Perhaps we should be rationalising our treatment so that we pipe it from at least some of those plants to the open ocean plant where there is lower treatment required and it's well away from the freshwater bodies and communities. And that's something that you see in towns and cities quite often. But we are hoping, and the government's intention is that these standards are providing that planning certainty for those councils to have those conversations with their communities. Next slide, thanks. The small wastewater treatment plant standards. So I said this is intended to apply to communities of 1,000, population of 1,000 or less. So our experience on the drinking water regulation side is it's actually really hard to regulate using population equivalents. People, move around. We have seasonal variation based on tourism. It's actually pretty hard to just count the number of people in each house. So to provide certainty around whether you qualify for the standard or not, it's based on an influent biological oxygen demand load. And that 85 kilo a day, it's a mean annual load. So that is based on what you would expect of a population of about 1,000 to be delivering to their wastewater treatment plants. So that's your qualifying criteria. So the standard itself is intended to apply to existing plants. If you are going to build a new plant, or if there's a significant development around a plant and the population balloons out well over 1,000 people, then you would need to upgrade to meet the general standard. So the main proposal that's in the discussion document right now is the removal of treatment requirements for total nitrogen and total phosphorus for the small plants, those small plants that qualify. And that is because, as I said, our understanding is that these small plants generally have a low impact on the environment for discharge of nutrients when you compare it to the diffuse load that is coming from places like farms. It's oxidation ponds. Generally, these plants are oxidation ponds. They also don't denitrify terribly well. And to add something to them to enable them to denitrify is really, really expensive. So generally, they do their job pretty well if they're functioning well. And so this standard is intended to be tailored to that outcome. We are seeking feedback on whether less stringent treatment requirements should be in place for other parameters. So an example, total suspended solids. Oxidation ponds, the waste stream is quite cloudy. As we understand it, and there's a few people on the call who could confirm this, I'm sure, as we understand it, oxidation ponds, the waste stream is quite cloudy, and that's because of the way they work. That's not, so a high total suspended solids limit would be inappropriate. Also considering whether pathogen treatment needs to be a requirement for plants that are in really isolated places. It's open for feedback. Dissolved oxygen standards, particularly focused on the oxidation ponds, and we are also proposing that there would be operational requirements included in the consent, quite specific ones. So say a 5-yearly desludging of the oxidation pond. If you don't do that, you're breaching your consent, and it's really clear to the regional council that you're breaching it. Next slide, thanks. So the discharge to land standard, we'll pause for questions after this one. So this is intended to work for territorial authorities. It's designed specifically for territorial authorities to be easy to pick up and use, really practical. And so why have we done this? Well, because half of the small plants in the country discharge to land, so it's pretty normal for those small plants. And it is something that we know communities want to discuss. So the site-specific risk assessment, the way that it works is a council would identify the plots of land sitting around a proposed treatment plant or an existing treatment plant that might be suitable for a discharge scheme. You do a site-specific risk assessment, and that will determine is the land suitable for discharge, and B, what are the risks? And based on those risks, you will get a category, and that determines your treatment requirements. So what a council can do way before it gets into the resource consenting process is identify the land that's suitable, identify the treatment requirements, and basically identify what the cost will be of the scheme, and that will not change all the way through the consenting process. That will be fixed, and what we hope is that really unlocks discharge to land as a viable option for those councils that have suitable land around them, and particularly for the small plants, that's the main thing that determines whether you can go for discharge to land. So also consistent monitoring and reporting for the same reasons as for discharge to water, and 35-year consents. So just quite quickly, so you step one, you do your baseline assessment, you determine your risks, risk category for the site, an in-depth assessment of the site, and on that basis you get a class, and the class determines your treatment requirements. So next slide, please. So you'll see these are the treatment requirements. Now the advice that we have had is that discharge to land, the land is doing treatment. So we have nitrogen and phosphorus treatments, loading rates, and E. coli. And so beyond that, the land is actually doing the treatments. And so we hope that this is a way of enabling a reasonably low cost approach toward discharge to land that is cost effective for those councils where it's a suitable option. For discharge to land, same rules apply as for discharge to water. The only other thing I'll add here, right, so actually we flip back to that last slide. So Gary's on the call, so he'll want me to mention this. Operations and management plan must be in place as, required on the consents, and we will be working to develop guidance around the O&M plan as part of this. So you have these annual loading rates for your scheme, and then you are required to do things like monitor aquifers, monitor for things like flooding, all of those things that you need to do to run the scheme, and then respond to environmental events are set out in your O&M plan that you have to comply with. A really important part of this to make sure that we are not poisoning water or land, which absolutely none of us are here for. I think it's time for questions.
I think it is. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Sarah. Before that, we've got 10 questions at this stage. Feel free to put more in, but we will have to keep an eye on the time with the answers. So firstly, from Ulrich Glasner. Kia ora, Ulrich. Ulrich's the Ashburton Water Services Manager. What is the consequence if you don't comply with the standards?
Or it's the same as if you don't comply with your resource consent, right? So the standards are, they will go directly into a resource consent. So regional councils will continue to be the regulator, make sure that there is compliance and enforcement with consent conditions. It's that simple.
Excellent. Andrew Chin, who's the head of Healthy Water's Strategic Initiatives. I think that's a great title.
Hi, Andrew.
Is there consideration of applying the standards to private wastewater treatment plants that service communities? There are a number of developments in Auckland building private plants serving over 100 households.
No, we don't have that power in our legislation, Andrew. If it was thought a good idea to have standards applying to private plants, that would need to be a change to our legislation in the bill that's in Parliament at the moment, and the window is closing on submission. So if your council wants to make a submission on that, you will need to go ahead and do that.
Too late.
It's too late. You've
Closed.
already made your submission.
So maybe they've already said it.
Yeah, you might have already said it. That being said, of course, quite a few of those schemes end up vesting in councils, as you well know, and at that stage, the standards would apply. So you would expect councils, I suppose, to either be regional councils to be requiring compliance with standards with those private schemes, or when the scheme vests in the council, then the standards should be applying at that stage.
Excellent. Matt from Timaru District Council. Kia ora, Matt. Are the limits for discharge to water the maximum limits?
Yes, they are the maximum limits, and so they will go well. So there might be a bit of confusion around this, right? So the standards that we have put up on the screen before, so they would go directly into your consent. Now, plants will outperform those limits. That's just what plants do, and in fact, the advice that we've had is that most plants will be easily capable of outperforming those limits. Now, it's not a compliance issue for you if you're doing better than the limits. That's just how your resource consent works, right? So we would expect everyone to be outperforming the limits every single day, and if they breach the limits, go below the treatment requirement, that's when you get pinged.
Rachel Shaw, who's the Senior Principal Water Engineer at Becker, asks, compliance based on annual medians or 90th percentiles, has there been any consideration of maxima for those parameters which have annual medians?
Rachel, that's a very good question, and I would only expect that from you. Yes, there has been consideration of those annual media, and if you look in the technical documents, that is on our landing page. There is a discharge to water technical document. There may be a discussion of it in there. From memory, and one of your colleagues is also on the call, and he will know the background to this. From memory, maximums were not thought a good idea, but we are open to submissions on that subject. It is something that others have raised. So I would talk to a couple of your Becker colleagues who know a bit more about these proposals than anybody else in the room here, and then if you think that's a good idea, make a submission or have a word with them.
And a question from Scott Campbell from the Dunedin City Council. In terms of discharge to water standards, the receiving environment monitoring, can the Regional Council require that via consent conditions? Now, in our discussion document on page 24, we say the standard will not require receiving environment monitoring. And also on page 5, it says any matters not covered by wastewater standards will continue to be set through the existing resource consent process as they are now. So, is receiving environment monitoring ruled out or at the discretion of Regional Council?
Right, great question, and one that we've had quite often. So the way the legislation works is that Regional Council can't impose requirements in a consent that are any more or any less restrictive than the standard. So what a Regional Council can't do is impose conditions in the, so these are end of pipe standards, right? So they can't impose conditions in flow or in the broader receiving environment that would be more restrictive than the standard. So they can't regulate the receiving environment as a backdoor way of requiring higher performance from the plants. So a regional council, there is nothing to prevent a regional council from requiring monitoring out there in the receiving environment. So monitoring what the plant's impact is, absolutely no problem with that. But the monitoring is only for information for the regional council and the plant operator. It can't be used as a way of requiring high performance.
And another great question from Scott. In terms of discharges to water and land standards, the bill says standards could specify RMA activity status and preclude some activities from public limited notification. What are the specific proposals in relation to activity status and notification requirements for discharges to land and water that meet the standards?
There are none. Yes, it is possible for us to set activity state. Well, so for the discharge to water and discharge to land standards, there are no proposals in relation to notification or activity status. For the overflow standard, you'll see that there are, and for the biosolids, you'll see that there are.
And Scott, you have another question there relating to iwi hapu, but we'll come back to that when we've moved away from this section. Ulrich asks, with the new standards, would you see a decrease in quality of the receiving environment over time?
The standards are intended to be protective of the environment and public health. So we did quite a bit of work on this. So at the moment, and I think I've got my numbers right because I was looking at them again yesterday, something like 75% of our water bodies are in a degraded state. The standards are intended to ensure that treatment plants pull their weight and improve the quality of those water bodies over time. For the smaller number of water bodies out there that are in reasonably good condition, the standards are intended to maintain those. If the plant is outperforming the standards, then the quality of the water body would improve.
John McAndrew, the DCC Three Waters Group Manager, says where a contaminant is not applicable, e.g. an open ocean metal, he thinks Dunedin accounts for at least 2 of the 6 you noted. He thinks it was stated that we will still need to apply for a consent to cover those not applicable parameters. In this case, is there any real change to the current approach other than the limits for the parameters that are defined and are fixed?
Hi, John. And yes, Tahuna plant, what a fantastic example of an upgrade that has made absolutely an incredible step change out there at Lawyers Head. I just want to say that is one of the examples that we continually looked at and talked about here as what happens when you get good outcomes for a community. So in answer to your question, yes, we do believe, and those that we work with believe that setting treatment limits for the key contaminants will make a significant difference to the consenting process. So most of the discussion, most of the engagement as we understand it, is about the treatment quality coming out of plants. If you look internationally, the areas that we are proposing standards, these are the same parameters that standards-based regimes deal with internationally. And so we've had some of New Zealand's experts looking in detail at consenting processes and where there would be cost savings, time savings, removal of engagements, and also removal of assessment of environmental effects. So yes, we do believe that. Look at the regulatory impact statements on our landing page. There's quite a lot of detail in there.
Ulrich asks, and it's possibly the only question today so far that I could answer, if a community decides to treat to a higher standard to provide a higher protection of the receiving environment, would that be acceptable? And I think the answer is yes.
Yes, that's acceptable. Well, I mean, we love that, don't we?
We love it, absolutely. John McAndrew asks as well, for small plants, if we already have nutrient limits in current consents, would we still need to meet these when we seek a new consent, or could the new consent exclude these to align with the standards?
So the way that the standards work is that whatever is set out in the standard would automatically go into the new consent for that plant. So under the proposals that are here, no, there would not be nutrient treatment limits when there was a new consent. That doesn't mean that the council might not choose to keep that infrastructure in place. But no, the way that the standards regime works is that the limits on the standard will go directly into a consent. One thing I would say here, and this is kind of a general comment, right? So moving from a case-by-case system, as we have at the moment, where there is a really high level of variability in treatment requirements across the country to a standards regime, means that there are unders and overs. So we have looked at consents in a lot of detail, and there are definitely unders and overs, and that is the nature of moving from a case-by-case regime to a standards-based regime. The other thing that we have seen, the proposal is, basically setting standards for what you would see in modern consents. The other thing that we have seen is that plants might have treatment limits for one or two of the parameters, or maybe three of the parameters that are dealt with here, but it's much less common for a plant's consent to have limits across the suite. And that, again, if you look internationally, is the benefit of a standards-based regime, because you are really requiring good performance from a plant across those major contaminants.
So I think it's 1:45 now, Michael. I'm just conscious of time with people having other engagements, perhaps at 1:00. Not us, but some of our viewers. What we may do is just pause our questions at this stage, come back to them if we have time, but work our way through the remainder of the presentation. If we don't get back to questions, obviously we'll come directly to the question.
You're the boss, Tim.
Okay. That's a dangerous thing to say. Back to you.
So biosolids. So this standard, as I said, is based on the Water New Zealand guidelines, which have been in place since 2002, recently comprehensively reviewed. So the proposal is to turn that biosolids guideline into a standard. There has been a biosolids standard in place in the EU since 1986. So we're a long way behind here. So it is a grading approach. So you take your sludge, you process it to grade, and that leads to activity status. So if you flick to the next slide, Andy, cheers. So actually go to the next one. So if you so the way that the standard works is you have a pathogen grade and you have a contaminant grade. If you meet the pathogen and contaminant grade, you're A1, fantastic. And then application of the biosolids to land is a permitted activity. If you meet the contaminants grade, but not the pathogen grade, it's a controlled activity, and there would be things like withholding periods in the consent. If you aren't meeting either, then it is a restricted discretionary activity. So not a definite no, but subject to much more rigorous control under the consent. Also, as part of the biosolids proposal, if you're applying biosolids to land in significant quantities, there's a nitrogen loading requirement, and that is pretty much what you would expect to see with any fertilizer. Cheers. Overflows and bypasses. So this is an audience that will understand this really, really well. Networks overflow. They're designed to overflow. They're old. They overflow really, really regularly. This is pretty much all networks, right? Bypasses of plants. Most plants will have a bypass arrangement, and they are used when it rains heavily and the network is overwhelmed to protect the plants. So half of the regions in the country are prohibiting overflows, and half of them controlling them through consents in some way. The result of that, so with good intention, the intention is to reduce the frequency of overflows, but what it's actually doing is it is driving monitoring and reporting underground. And so that means that the regulatory system is actually disincentivizing councils from monitoring and reporting the overflows that are happening, understanding that network, and then directing their investments in a cost-effective way at those areas of the network that require it most. So that is not a good situation. 4 bypasses of treatment plants. So a lot of those are being treated as emergency activities, so they don't have a consent. So again, there's not monitoring, there's not transparent reporting around the bypasses. So the proposal here is really to pick up on the basic approach that has been adopted in Auckland. All existing overflow points would be required to have consent. All bypasses of treatment plants required to have a consent. And so this is something that, as part of our technical review group, the regional councils asked us to do. They said it's actually too hard for us to do this because the community perspective on overflows is understandably feelings run very high about overflows. So this is intended to be a way to ensure the regulatory system responds to overflows and reduces their frequency over time, as we are seeing in Auckland. Monitoring and reporting requirements for overflows will be based on risk. So that's a really important part of the proposal here, based on risk. So we're really worried about the high risk overflows in particular. And then finally, a different tool in our legislation, risk management plan. So that's an overlay to ensure that there's comprehensive risk management. Next slide, thanks. So telemetric monitoring required at all engineered overflow points that are classified as high risk, all the new overflow points, all pump stations, all uncontrolled overflow points where they're happening regularly. That's places where they shouldn't. And then so reporting across the risk categories is separated out into first response. You have to tell your community for the high risk ones immediately. You have to tell the regional council, public health immediately, and then follow-up reporting. This is why it happens. This is what's going on. This is what we're going to do to ensure that it happens less regularly in future. So we have worked pretty hard as part of the standards work program to simplify the existing processes. Really important to simplify existing resource management processes. They are expensive. They take a lot of time, so by and large, what is proposed here is pretty similar to what the existing process is, but there are definitely efficiencies. Stage 1, so nothing in the Local Government Act changes as part of these proposals. So territorial authorities still need to be engaging with their communities about the preferred treatment option. So if that is, so you've got options that might be, okay, we want to move that treatment plant from a wahitapu, move it to a place that's more acceptable, or we want to move that discharge point from the estuary to open ocean. We want to consolidate 3 plants into 1 plant. We want to move discharge to water. We want to move it to land and keep that existing oxidation pond as a kind of primary treatment. So those conversations all happen with the communities. Once, what the standards will do is they will set the treatment requirements. So when you're talking to those communities, you will be able to say exactly, this is what your option is. This is pretty much what it's going to cost you. You will move from 300 options, we hope, down to like 10 or 15 options. And that is a really big plus for a standards-based regime that we've seen internationally. So then you lodge your consent. The regional council runs through its process in the normal way. The big thing that changes there is the treatment requirements are set. They can't change right through that process, including in the decision on the consent. Other things like air emissions, like structures in waterways, so they still are dealt with in the normal way. If heavy metals limits are required, then they're all dealt with in the normal way. And then you get a decision on the consent. You build your plant. Compliance and monitoring looks quite different, okay? So plant operators, you should be dealing with, over time, consistent monitoring and reporting requirements across all your plants. That is fundamentally different than the system at the moment. Watercare, Andrew will tell the story. Watercare went up to Auckland. Andrew, you told me the story. Watercare went up to Northland to have a look at its plants, and they were all doing completely different things, and it was very, very difficult for those Northland councils to be running those plants because they are all their consent requirements are all completely different. So Watercare is really moving towards standardisation of its plant operation. That's really good for for operator capability and training. So regional councils as well, monitoring and reporting is really standardised. What we hope to see is quite a lot more consistency, definitely a whole lot more transparency around compliance and enforcement. Transition arrangements. Sorry, there's quite a bit to get through in these slides, but these are really important. So there's a couple of transition arrangements in the bill in Parliament. The first is that if you're operating on Section 124, if you're one of the 20% of plants operating on Section 124, you can withdraw your application and prepare a new one that complies with the standard, and then make a re-application, and then you can rely on Section 124 again. For those plants where their consents expire within 2 years of that bill being enacted, there's about 30 plants in this situation, your consent will be extended to 2 years after enactment. So you have time to understand the standards, make your application, and then we would expect, we don't expect all of those to be dealt with at once. We would expect some of those plants will immediately go on to Section 124, and the regional council will grind its way to you. Finally, at the moment, you can operate on Section 124 indefinitely. And so Wastewater operating on Section 124 for 24 years, a number of plants for more than 10 years. So the proposal is that with the certainty that is brought by a standards-based regime, it will only be necessary to operate on Section 124 for much shorter periods. The proposal is it will be for a maximum of 2 years, and that would take effect 5 years after the standards are made. So we give ourselves 7 years to really get on top of that backlog of consents. Iwi and Hapu engagement. John King is on the call, and he's going to speak to these slides. Kia ora, John.
Kia ora, Michael. Tēnā kia koutou. Ko John King tēnei. I'm a chief advisor working in the iwi and hapu engagement and treaty space. So quickly, because I know we're short on time, our engagement approach has focused across a number of different identified groups. We've undertaken some targeted engagement regarding our direct treaty settlement obligations. So we have some specific obligations in the Waikato Waipa and the Whanganui River catchments. We've also undertaken some broader engagement through some online webinars, which are ongoing, starting up from next week as well. And then also you would have seen in some of the material to support the proposals, some case studies where we've undertaken to understand iwi and hapu views on wastewater consenting arrangements across 6 different treatment plants. We've also sought some additional technical advice through the technical reference group or review group and our Māori advisory group Te Puna. And we're continuing to identify additional engagements through the public consultation phase. So if you are aware of particular water bodies or obligations that might exist in your areas that you think we need to be cognizant of, we would welcome those being provided to us. Next slide. I've touched briefly on this, but we have some specific treaty settlement obligations, as I said. We're undertaking ongoing engagement with relevant river iwi and those catchments to understand their preferences and how the standards may apply in those areas. And we're undertaking additional analysis of broader treaty settlement arrangements across the country to ensure that other relevant obligations that may be in other treaty settlement arrangements or through other instruments like under the Resource Management Act, mana whakahono arohia arrangements are also being considered in the development of the standards. Kia ora.
Okay, I'm going to rattle through the next 3 slides in 30 seconds. So thanks so much, John, and thanks, Michael. We're in a period now where we're engaging with as many people as possible. Then there will be a few more steps to go through until we hope to have the standards launched around August, and timeframes will depend a little bit on the bill that's currently before Parliament. One really important thing to note is that we will also be working on an implementation package, so a lot of guidance and other materials so that these standards land really well for TAs, for regional councils and communities. That's really important that for all of us that these work as well as they possibly can. We've got a whole load of webinars that are on our website, and if you look at our website, there are all different ways that people can get in touch with us, and we're really open to having further conversations and meetings and taking all of these questions we haven't got to and looking at how we can answer those. We are setting up some more kind of detailed Q&A sessions later in the consultation period, so that would be another good opportunity to throw us some tricky questions. We're always keen to answer those.
Okay, thank you, Sarah and Mike. And in terms of tricky questions, we've still got a swag to get through, so we'll do our very best. Ulrich has asked, will the O&M plan be approved by the regulator?
That is actually some detail that we are yet to work through. Ulrich, if you look at on our landing page, there's a technical document for discharge to land standard. So there is a question about the extent to which the O&M plan sits in the consent, sits outside the consent, is dealt with in guidance. So we are going to be working particularly with regional councils on that detail to kind of build the implementation support package. So watch this space, and if you want to be involved, then let us know.
Amy McSporran from the Gore Council has asked, if you have just gotten a new wastewater discharge consent, would we expect to be able to apply for a variation under the new standards?
That's something that you would have to take legal advice on and talk to your regional council. So that would be a question about how the resource management system works. The standards will apply to new consents. So that is a discussion you need to have with your regional council.
Mikhail Zonka, the Environmental Care Manager for Water Care, asks, what is the proposed frequency of monitoring for discharge quality?
Yeah, so again, that is something that we are looking to work with the sector on. And that is part of the implementation support. That would actually be required as part of the standard, so it would go into your consent. So we would expect to see standardisation on that.
Rachel from Becker asks, what of existing consent conditions are more stringent than the ones in the proposed standards? Can the consent holder expect a relaxation in the standards when they apply for a new consent for that discharge?
So again, Rachel, so there are unders and overs when you move from a case-by-case regulatory system to a standardised regulatory system. So there will be some examples where treatment requirements are more stringent. There will be a lot more examples, significantly more examples where treatment requirements are less stringent. So we know there are plants out there, for example, that have no treatment quality requirements on them whatsoever. Some councils have a large number of those plants. When you apply for a new consent, the treatment requirements in the standard would apply in that new consent. So if that means that one of those treatment requirements decreases, yes, that's the way that it works. The council can still outperform the standards. That's what we would expect. Of course, to decrease treatment requirements may also require a change in infrastructure, and many councils may choose not to do that. Their communities may not want to do that. So I don't think it's just a straightforward matter of saying, well, we're going to drop our treatment and walk away.
Grant Hall says or asks, the open ocean criteria requires typically a greater than 500 metre long outfall. What mechanism will there be to be classed as open ocean if the mixing is very active, but the pipe needs to be, say, 400 metres long?
Yeah. So if you look at the discharge to water technical report that's on our landing page, you'll see quite a bit of information in there about how we categorise the different water receiving environments. So that is something that we received some really good technical advice on. So go and look at that, and that will identify whether your discharge falls into the open ocean category or the inshore coastal. So it's not just about plant length. From memory, and this is a discussion that Gary and I had directly, it's also about the pipe depth. So I think from memory, if you get more than 10 metres under, then you fall into the open ocean category.
Scott Campbell says, overflows and bypasses standard. The control activity status is helpful. Will the standard specify consent term like the proposed standards for discharge to water and land do, i.e. 35 years?
Oh, I think we're open to submissions on that particular topic.
Righty-ho, and a couple more to go. Matt Bayliss has asked, re the transition arrangements, what about a situation where a consent has been recently issued requiring upgrades, but the upgrades have not yet been implemented? Will there be a process to obtain a new or revised consent based on the standards?
If the consent's been issued, the consent's been issued, and you would need to talk to your regional council. For example, if you wanted to so that is a question for legal advice about whether you can hand in your resource consents and step into a process to apply for a new one. That's something you'd need to take legal advice and talk to your regional council about.
And finally, Andrew Finch has asked, can a copy of the slides be made available? So
That's easy.
Absolutely, Andrew. And they'll be in your inbox in about 5 minutes, all right?
Excellent. And I think I'm right in saying that that is us, not quite. We did have one back from Scott Campbell that we had skipped over because it related to
Treaty
settlement obligations. So just give me a moment while I find that one. Hopefully not more than a moment. Scott asked a number of very good questions. Scott.
Far away, Janelle. What's the question?
On a related note, the discussion document notes that iwi and Hapu prefer ongoing at-place decision-making. How will this be addressed going forward?
The question is, iwi and Hapu expect ongoing at-place decision-making. How will this be addressed going forward? So, in a nutshell, there will continue to be obligations on a territorial authority under the Local Government Act to engage with iwi and Hapu, particularly in relation to those significant areas, significant water bodies, and have discussions about what service delivery looks like before there is a consent application being made. So none of that is going to change. The moving to a standards-based work program, standards-based regulatory arrangements means that treatment limits for the main contaminants are set. So that will reduce the influence that all communities have, that everybody has, and that includes Māori, on what the treatment outcomes are. That being said, the treatment limits are set at a level that is intended to protect public health and the environment. What we see regularly with treatment plants and iwi and Hapu experience is 10, 15-year-long conversations, engagement on upgrades in the area. So that is a burden. And this is an area that will change. So it is different people will have different views on that, but that is what the standards-based work program means. Finally, so across all of the standards, it is intended that there is significantly better public transparency around the operation of plants and the frequency of overflows. So that is going to increase iwi and Hapu involvement in the performance of the plants and networks in that area, significantly increase for many people. It is really difficult to find out that information at the moment, and that's for those people like myself who are able to go and have a good look around for it. So a lot of this is about direct reporting to communities who are interested or who might be affected. And so that is a big change to the system.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to a conclusion at 9 minutes over time, which is just reflective of the fantastic questions that we've had. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Michael, for that really, really interesting webinar. I'm amazed, as I say, we've been through 7 of these. I'm learning every time and still amazed at the enthusiasm you bring to it. Thank you so much to everyone who has attended. It's gratifying to see such a large number and so many people staying on. There will be slides and recordings made available afterwards. So I'll just close this off with karakia. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, manakatia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, eo ke te aorangi. Thank you so much, everybody. Kia pai tūrā whakatā. Have a fantastic weekend. And if you found this to be useful, please do tell your friends. And on our website is other available webinars and Q&A sessions as we continue through this consultation. Thank you very much for your time again.